A stepson's secret affair spirals into obsession and a grisly murder. Let's dive into the details. Isabella Carrington was a vibrant 38-year-old woman known for her artistic talents and kind-hearted nature. She lived in Pinewood, South Carolina, a small town known for its charming downtown and the annual Blossom Town Festival. Isabella worked as a freelance artist, creating beautiful paintings and sculptures that she sold at local art fairs and galleries. Isabella lived with her husband Thomas Carrington and her 18-year-old stepson Ethan. Thomas was a retired naval officer, and they had been married for 10 years. Despite their 20-year age difference, Isabella and Thomas were deeply in love. They met at a local art show where Isabella's work was being displayed. Thomas was immediately drawn to her creativity and passion for life. Isabella tried her best to create a happy and harmonious home, balancing her freelance work with managing the household and caring for Ethan. She was a motherly figure to Ethan, who had lost his biological mother a few years earlier. Isabella and Ethan's relationship was said to be strained, but she remained hopeful that they could eventually bond. In her free time, Isabella enjoyed reading and gardening. She was a big fan of classic literature, often quoting Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters. Her garden was filled with vibrant flowers, a testament to her love for nature. Isabella was also active in the local community, volunteering at the Pinewood Public Library and participating in neighborhood events. In the days leading up to her death, Isabella was excited about a new art project. She was working on a series of sculptures inspired by the local wildlife and landscapes of South Carolina. Isabella planned to showcase these pieces at the upcoming Blossom Town Festival. She was also looking forward to a small family getaway she had planned, hoping it would help mend the strained relationship between her and Ethan. Isabella's friends described her as charismatic and friendly. She had a close-knit social circle and was always willing to lend a helping hand. Her friends recalled how Isabella would often host dinner parties, cooking delicious meals and creating a warm, welcoming atmosphere. Despite the challenges in her life, Isabella remained optimistic and full of dreams. She hoped to open her own art gallery someday and inspire others with her work. Tragically, her dreams were cut short by a brutal and senseless act of violence. Isabella's life was a testament to her resilience and creativity, and her loss was deeply felt by all who knew her. On the morning of September 12, 2012, Pinewood was just waking up. It was a cool, clear day with the sun shining brightly. Around 8:30 a.m., Isabella Carrington's neighbor, Mira Gates, walked over to the Carrington house. Mira, who was 25 years old, lived next door. She often visited Isabella to discuss her true crime novel, which she was working on, based on real-life events. Mira knocked on the door, but no one answered. She found this odd because Isabella was usually up early, working in her art studio. The studio was a small, separate building in the backyard. Mira decided to check there. As she approached the studio, she noticed the door was slightly open. When Mira entered, she was greeted by a horrific scene. Isabella was lying on the floor, covered in blood. The room was in chaos, with broken sculptures and shattered glass everywhere. Isabella's body showed signs of a violent struggle. Mira was shocked and horrified. Her hands trembled as she quickly dialed 911 on her cell phone. The 911 operator, calming Mira as best they could, instructed her to stay outside and wait for the police. Mira, still in shock, followed the instructions. She stood in the yard, staring at the studio, trying to process what she had just seen. The police arrived within minutes. As they began their investigation, they noted the heavy sculpture near Isabella's body. It was clear this was the murder weapon used to inflict multiple blunt force trauma injuries. The amount of blood and the state of the studio indicated a frenzied attack. Mira was interviewed by the police. She was still shaken but managed to provide a clear account of her mourning. She described her relationship with Isabella and her reasons for visiting her. Mira's detailed observations helped the investigators piece together the timeline of events leading up to the discovery of Isabella's body. The discovery of Isabella Carrington's body marked the beginning of a complex and emotional investigation. Her friends and neighbors were left in shock, struggling to understand how such a brutal crime could happen in their peaceful community. When the police arrived at the Carrington house on the morning of September 12, 2012, they knew they had a serious crime on their hands. It was a sunny day in Pinewood, and the peaceful neighborhood was quickly disturbed by the flashing lights and sirens of police cars. Detective Michael Santos, a seasoned investigator known for his thoroughness, led the team. With him was Officer Emily Vargas, who was respected for her calm and methodical approach. They had both seen many crime scenes, but the brutality of this one stood out. The art studio where Isabella's body was found was a small building in the backyard. As they entered, the detectives were met with a gruesome sight. Blood was splattered on the walls, and the floor was covered with broken sculptures and shattered glass. The room looked like a scene from a horror movie, a far cry from the creative space it usually was. Isabella's body lay on the floor, showing signs of a violent struggle. It was clear that she had been beaten to death with a heavy sculpture found nearby. The sculpture was stained with blood, indicating it was the murder weapon. Isabella had multiple blunt force trauma injuries, suggesting a frenzied and brutal attack. The police immediately began their investigation. They cordoned off the area to preserve evidence. Detective Santos and Officer Vargas carefully examined the crime scene, looking for any clues. They used advanced forensic techniques, including fingerprint dusting and blood pattern analysis, to piece together what had happened. The detectives worked quickly but meticulously. They collected samples of blood and hair for DNA analysis and took photographs of the scene from every angle. They also found a few items that seemed out of place, like a torn piece of cloth and a broken piece of jewelry, which they bagged as evidence. Outside, neighbors gathered, watching with a mix of fear and curiosity. The police asked anyone who had seen or heard anything unusual to come forward. They also conducted door-to-door interviews to gather more information about the hours leading up to the discovery of Isabella's body. As the day went on, the police presence grew. Additional officers arrived to help with the investigation, and the media started to gather, drawn by the shocking nature of the crime. News reporters from local stations like WPN and the Herald Observer began reporting live from the scene, adding to the growing sense of urgency. By the end of the day, the police had gathered a substantial amount of evidence, but many questions remained: who could have done this, and why? Detective Santos and Officer Vargas knew they had a long road ahead, but they were determined to find justice for Isabella. Thomas Carrington, Isabella's husband, was the first suspect the police investigated. Thomas, who was 58 years old, had a disciplined and stoic personality shaped by his years of service in the Navy. He had married Isabella 10 years ago, providing her with stability and support. Despite his stern exterior, Thomas was deeply in love with Isabella and very protective of his family. On September 12, 2012, after the police discovered Isabella's body, they brought Thomas in for questioning. Detective Michael Santos and Officer Emily Vargas conducted the interview. Thomas appeared calm but was clearly shaken by the news of his wife's death. He told the detectives that he had been away on a business trip, staying at a Hampton Inn in Boston. He provided hotel receipts and a confirmation of his check-in and check-out times to back up his alibi. Thomas's interview lasted several hours. The detectives asked him about his relationship with Isabella and any possible enemies. Thomas Carrington spoke about the tensions between Isabella and his son Ethan. He mentioned that Ethan had been acting out since the death of his biological mother and struggled to accept Isabella as a mother figure. Thomas believed that despite these challenges, the family would eventually reconcile. The police also searched the Carrington home for additional evidence. They went through Thomas's belongings and searched his car but found nothing suspicious. They interviewed Thomas's colleagues and checked his phone records, all of which confirmed his alibi. Throughout the investigation, Thomas maintained his composure. However, the strain was visible. He expressed his grief and disbelief that someone could harm Isabella. He was cooperative with the police and provided them with any information they requested. Meanwhile, the local news outlets such as WPN and the Herald Observer reported on the investigation. Neighbors and friends of the Carringtons were shocked to hear that Thomas was a suspect. Many described him as a kind and loving husband who would never harm his wife. Despite his strong alibi, the police continued to investigate Thomas to ensure nothing was overlooked. They re-examined the crime scene and cross-checked all the details of his alibi. Detective Michael Santos and Officer Emily Vargas wanted to be thorough, leaving no stone unturned. As days passed, it became clear that Thomas was not involved in Isabella's murder. The focus of the investigation shifted to other potential suspects. While Thomas was cleared, the pain of losing Isabella and being under suspicion was a heavy burden he had to bear. On September 15, 2012, just 3 days after the discovery of Isabella's body, Pinewood was covered in a light drizzle. The gray skies matched the somber mood in the town. Around noon, While reviewing the evidence collected from the crime scene, Detective Michael Santos noticed something unusual hidden among Isabella's art supplies in her studio: dozens of letters. These were not just any letters, but sexually explicit love letters exchanged between Isabella and someone else. Detective Santos and Officer Emily Vargas carefully read through the letters. The content revealed a secret affair between Isabella and an unidentified individual. The letters spoke graphically of secret sex acts and deep conflicting emotions. This discovery was a significant breakthrough in the case and suggested a possible motive for the murder. Detective Santos called for a meeting with the entire investigative team. They discussed the contents of the letters and the implications. The team knew they had to identify the other person involved in the affair to understand the full context and potential motives. Officer Vargas led the effort to gather more information. She visited Isabella's close friends and neighbors, asking if anyone knew about the affair. Many were shocked and had no idea Isabella was involved with someone other than her husband, Thomas. The news quickly spread through the small, very conservative Southern community, creating a buzz of gossip and speculation. Meanwhile, forensic experts analyzed the letters for fingerprints and DNA evidence. They also checked Isabella's phone records and email history to find clues about her secret lover. The investigation was thorough, and every detail was scrutinized. On the same rainy afternoon, while examining Isabella's phone, the detectives found a series of explicit text messages and call logs that led them to suspect Ethan, Isabella's 18-year-old stepson. The messages hinted at a strained and complicated sexual relationship between Isabella and Ethan. Some of the texts were vague, while others were more explicit and graphically described their sexual relationship. Detective Santos and Officer Vargas were shocked by this new revelation. Ethan had always been seen as a troubled teenager, but the extent of his relationship with Isabella was unexpected. The detectives knew they had to approach this delicately to get to the truth. The discovery of the love letters and text messages shifted the focus of the investigation. The police now had a clearer direction, and the pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together. They prepared to interrogate Ethan again, this time with new compelling evidence that could unlock the secrets behind Isabella's tragic death. Ethan Carrington, Isabella's 18-year-old stepson, became the focus of the investigation after the discovery of the love letters and text messages. Ethan was a troubled teenager, still struggling with the death of his biological mother and the arrival of Isabella into his life. He often acted out, showing signs of resentment towards Isabella for taking his mother's place. Despite this, he was intelligent and ambitious, with a passion for music. He spent hours playing his guitar, dreaming of becoming a famous musician. On September 16, 2012, Ethan was brought in for questioning. Detective Michael Santos and Officer Emily Vargas conducted the interview. Ethan appeared nervous but tried to remain calm. The detectives began by asking him about his relationship with Isabella. Ethan admitted that their relationship was strained but denied any involvement in her murder. When the detectives presented the love letters, Ethan's demeanor changed. He became visibly upset and defensive. He confessed to the affair, explaining that they started having sex about a year ago. Ethan said he became obsessed with Isabella, believing that they could be together if his father, Thomas, were out of the picture. However, Isabella tried to end the affair and focus on her marriage, which frustrated Ethan. The detectives pressed Ethan for more details. They asked him about the night of Isabella's murder. Ethan claimed he was at a friend's house watching movies. The police checked his alibi, but it was weak and lacked concrete evidence. His friend Jake said Ethan was with him but couldn't remember specific details or times. Ethan's reaction to the interrogation was a mix of anger and fear. He was defensive and argumentative, denying any involvement in the murder while expressing his frustration over Isabella ending the affair. The detectives noted his conflicting emotions, which seemed to oscillate between sadness and anger. While Ethan was a prime suspect, the police needed more evidence to link him directly to the crime. They continued to analyze the physical evidence from the crime scene and cross-referenced it with Ethan's statements. The detectives also reviewed security camera footage from the neighborhood, hoping to find any inconsistencies in Ethan's alibi. The investigation into Ethan was intense and thorough. Detective Santos and Officer Vargas were determined to uncover the truth. They knew Ethan had a motive, but they needed solid evidence to prove his involvement. The love letters and text messages were crucial, but they had to build a strong case. The investigation was far from over, and the detectives continued to piece together the puzzle. Ethan remained a key figure in the case, and the police were determined to find justice for Isabella. Mira Gates, the Carringtons' 25-year-old neighbor, became another person of interest in the investigation. Mira lived next door and frequently visited the Carrington house. She had a keen interest in true crime stories and was working on a novel based on real-life events. Mira was known for her observant nature and was often seen taking notes and photos around the neighborhood. On September 17, 2012, the police brought Mira in for questioning. Detective Michael Santos and Officer Emily Vargas conducted the interview. Mira appeared calm and cooperative. She explained that she had a passion for writing and was fascinated by true crime. She often visited Isabella to discuss her novel and get feedback on her writing. The detectives asked Mira about the morning she discovered Isabella's body. Mira recounted the events in detail, describing how she found the studio door slightly open and discovered Isabella lying on the floor. She spoke about her shock and horror and how she immediately called 911. The detectives noted that Mira's account was consistent with the initial report. As the questioning continued, the detectives probed deeper into Mira's relationship with the Carringtons. Mira admitted that she often observed the family dynamics, noting the tension between Isabella and Ethan. She also mentioned that she had seen Ethan acting suspiciously on several occasions but didn't think much of it at the time. The detectives asked Mira about her interest in true crime and whether it influenced her actions. Mira explained that her interest was purely academic and creative. She was writing a novel and used her observations to create realistic characters and scenarios. She denied any involvement in Isabella's murder and insisted that she was just a concerned neighbor. Mira's calm and cooperative demeanor made it difficult for the detectives to determine if she was hiding anything. They decided to search her house for any evidence that might link her to the crime. They found several notebooks filled with detailed observations about the neighborhood and the Carringtons, but nothing directly incriminating. Despite her cooperation, Mira remained a person of interest. The detectives continued to monitor her closely, looking for any inconsistencies in her story. They also reviewed the security footage from the neighborhood, hoping to find any evidence that could either implicate or clear her. As the investigation into Mira continued, the detectives faced the challenge of distinguishing between her genuine interest in true crime and any potential involvement in Isabella's death. The complexity of the case deepened, but the police remained committed to finding the truth and bringing justice for Isabella. On September 20th, 2012, the investigation took a significant turn. Detective Michael Santos and Officer Emily Vargas had gathered enough evidence to identify the murderer. The evidence pointed to Ethan Carrington, Isabella's 18-year-old stepson. Ethan's conflicting emotions, his troubled relationship with Isabella, and the discovery of the love letters and text messages all pointed to a clear motive. The detectives had also found traces of Isabella's blood on Ethan's shoes, which he had tried to clean but couldn't completely remove. The forensic evidence, combined with Ethan's weak alibi and the motive, was enough to charge him with the murder of Isabella Carrington. Ethan was arrested on September 21st, 2012, and charged with first-degree murder. The community was shocked by the news, as the case had garnered significant attention. The trial began on January 15, 2013. The prosecution presented a compelling case, detailing the troubled relationship between Ethan and Isabella, the discovery of the love letters, and the forensic evidence that linked Ethan to the crime. The defense tried to argue that Ethan was a troubled teenager who had been manipulated by Isabella, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. On February 5, 2013, the jury found Ethan Carrington guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict brought some closure to the Carrington family and the Pinewood community. The trial and the events leading up to it had left a lasting impact on everyone involved. The murder of Isabella Carrington was a tragic and senseless act, driven by a complex web of emotions and relationships. The case served as a reminder of the dark side of human nature and the consequences of unresolved conflicts. The investigation had been thorough, and the detectives had worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. The case had taken many twists and turns, but in the end, justice was served. The memory of Isabella Carrington would live on, and the town of Pinewood would slowly heal from the trauma of her death. Isabella's friends and family were relieved that the murderer had been caught, but the pain of losing Isabella remained. The arrest of Ethan Carrington brought some closure to the case, but the journey to justice was far from over. The next step was the trial. where the full extent of Ethan's actions and motives would be revealed. The trial of Ethan Carrington began on November 5, 2012, in Pinewood, South Carolina. The courtroom was filled with reporters, friends, and family members, all eager to hear the details of the case. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney James Bliver, a seasoned lawyer known for his tenacity and thoroughness. At 45 years old, with a stern demeanor that commanded respect, Bliver argued that Ethan's obsession with Isabella, coupled with his anger over her ending their affair, led him to commit the brutal murder. He presented the love letters, text messages, and forensic evidence linking Ethan to the crime. The prosecution's case was solid, painting a clear picture of Ethan's motive and actions. The defense was handled by public defender Sarah Jane Lemon, a compassionate and determined attorney who had been practicing law for over 20 years. At 42 years old, she was known for her dedication to her clients. Lemon argued that Ethan was a troubled teenager who had been deeply affected by his mother's death and was struggling with mental health issues. She claimed that Ethan's actions were not premeditated, but a result of emotional turmoil and confusion. Throughout the trial, the emotional toll on Isabella's family was evident. Her husband, Thomas Carrington, sat in the front row, his face etched with grief and disbelief. Friends and family members wept quietly as they listened to the details of Isabella's tragic death. After several weeks of testimony and evidence, the jury deliberated for 2 days. On December 3, 2012, they returned with a verdict. Ethan Carrington was found guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the verdict. Ethan showed little emotion, his face blank as he listened to his fate. The sentencing took place on December 10, 2012. Ethan was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge stated that while Ethan's actions were driven by emotional distress, the brutality of the crime warranted a severe punishment. The sentence aimed to provide justice for Isabella and her family while acknowledging Ethan's troubled background. Isabella's family had mixed reactions to the sentence. Some felt it was too lenient given the nature of the crime, while others believed it was a fair balance between justice and compassion for Ethan's mental state. The community of Pinewood was left to grapple with the aftermath of the tragedy, hoping to find some sense of closure. The trial and sentencing of Ethan Carrington were widely covered by local media, including WPN and the Herald Observer. The case served as a somber reminder of the impact of emotional and mental health issues and the devastating consequences they can have. After Ethan Carrington was sentenced to 25 years in prison, life in Pinewood, South Carolina, began to slowly move forward. The trial had been a traumatic experience for everyone involved, leaving lasting impacts on the community. Thomas Carrington, Isabella's husband, struggled to cope with the loss of his wife and the imprisonment of his son. He took a leave of absence from his job and sought counseling to deal with his grief and the overwhelming sense of betrayal. Friends and neighbors provided support, but Thomas often felt isolated. He decided to move to Charleston to start fresh, away from the painful memories in Pinewood. Ethan's incarceration was a difficult adjustment for him as well. He was sent to a state correctional facility where he began receiving psychological counseling. The prison system offered educational programs, and Ethan enrolled in classes to complete his high school education. He also began studying music theory, still clinging to his dream of becoming a musician someday. Mira Gates, the Carringtons' neighbor and true crime enthusiast, was deeply affected by the entire ordeal. She continued to write her novel, now incorporating the harrowing experience she had lived through. The local media, including WPN and the Herald Observer, featured interviews with Mira discussing her perspective on the case. Despite the unwanted attention, Mira remained focused on her writing, finding solace in her creative work. Detective Michael Santos and Officer Emily Vargas, the lead investigators, received commendations for their diligent work in solving the case. The success of their investigation reinforced their commitment to justice and the importance of thorough police work. The case also highlighted the need for increased support for mental health issues, both within families and the broader community. Life in Pinewood gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the memory of Isabella Carrington and the tragic events that unfolded remained etched in the hearts of those who knew her. The town's resolve to support mental health initiatives and honor Isabella's legacy became a lasting tribute to her life. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Crime Case Studios. The tragic story of Isabella Carrington reminds us of the complexities of human relationships and the dark paths obsession can lead us down. Join us next time as we explore another case in our pursuit of truth and justice. Stay safe.